In Chapter 12, we will discuss using databases with PHP. By the end of the chapter, you should be able to use the MySQL database, create a simple database for a basic blog site, and run basic SQL commands. Currently, there are two primary libraries for working with databases in PHP, MySQLi and PDO. MySQLi stands for MySQL Improved. It's an improvement over the previous MySQL library. PDO stands for PHP Data Objects. This textbook uses the MySQLi library. Visit the link at the bottom of the slide for a brief explanation of both libraries. Introduction to SQL. A database is a collection of information. The information in a database is stored in tables. Tables consist of rows and columns. You can think of tables like spreadsheets with rows and columns. Each row is a record, each column is a field. Most databases use a language called SQL to access and manipulate the data inside the tables. SQL stands for Structured Query Language, sometimes pronounced SQL. You can see some of the common SQL commands on the slide. We will use several of these commands in this chapter. If you aren't familiar with SQL, there are plenty of tutorials on the internet. One of these tutorials can be found using the link at the bottom of the slide. PHP and SQL are two different languages and have different purposes. We use PHP to send SQL commands to the database. PHP doesn't actually run the SQL. The SQL commands are run inside the database. Any results from the SQL commands are returned to the PHP script. The PHP script code processes the results. In PHP, we can use the MySQLi query function to send SQL commands to the MySQL database. We will learn more about this function later in this chapter. Connecting to MySQL. Even though there are several databases to choose from, this chapter will focus on using the MySQL database. To use a database, the first thing you need to do is connect to the database. The connection gives you access to run commands in the database. Use the MySQLi connect function to connect to the MySQL database. The syntax for the MySQLi connect function is shown on the slide. The database connection is assigned to the DBC variable. You will use the DBC variable to run SQL commands in the database. When you're finished with the database, use the MySQLi close function to close the database connection. Visit the link at the bottom of the slide for additional information. To connect to a MySQL database, the example code is taken from the MySQLi connect.php file, script 12.1. It creates a connection to the MySQL database and displays a message indicating whether the connection was successful or not. First, create a database connection using the MySQLi connect function. A reference for the connection is stored in the DBC variable. If the connection is successful, print a success message and call the MySQLi close function to close the connection. If the connection is not successful, print an error message. You will need to change the username, password, and database name parameters in the MySQLi connect function to match your database. The database and the user must exist for the connection to complete successfully. Upload this file to your web server and run it to test your database connection. The code on my server looks like this. You can see where I changed the username, password, and database name to match my database. When I run my script, it looks like this. MySQL error handling. There are several common errors that you will encounter when working with a database. Use the MySQLi error function to get detailed information about most errors. Connection errors are slightly different. Use the MySQLi connect error function for information about connection errors. To use error handling, the example code is taken from the MySQLi connect.php file script12.2. It's basically the same as a previous connection script, except that it prints detailed information about any connection errors. First, create a database connection using the MySQLi connect function. By default, if the connection fails, the MySQLi connect function will report any critical errors and terminate the script. To avoid the default error handling behavior, include the @ symbol at the beginning of the MySQLi connect function call. This will allow you to capture the connection error message in a more controlled way by using the MySQLi connect error function. Then, include the MySQLi connect error function in the error message display. If the connection is not successful, the display will include information about what went wrong with the connection. Upload this file to your web server and run it to test your database connection. You could also try with an invalid username or database name to see the connection error display. If I change my username, I get the following error. Creating a table. To store information in a database, you need a table. Use the create table SQL command to create a table. The syntax for the create table command is create table, then the table name, then inside the parenthesis the column definitions for each column in the table. Each individual column definition is separated by a comma. The definition for a column includes the name and the data type. Common data types are text, varchar, datetime, and integer. Look at the example on the slide. Start with the create table command keywords, then the table name, in this case my table, then the opening parenthesis, then the column definitions, and finally the closing parenthesis. The column definitions in this table include the ID field of type integer and the information field of type text. In addition, the ID field is designated as a primary key. The primary key is a unique value that identifies each record. Visit the link at the bottom of the slide for additional information. Use the MySQLi query function to run SQL commands, such as the create table SQL command. Here's an example of using PHP to run SQL. The MySQLi query function is a PHP function and runs on the web server like any other PHP function. It sends SQL commands to the connected database. The SQL commands are run in the database. This is completely separate from any code running in PHP. And any results from the SQL command are returned to the PHP script. The syntax for the MySQLi query function is call the MySQLi query function with two arguments. The first argument is the database connection, and the second argument is the SQL command to run in the database. As an example, we will create a table called entries. It will contain 4 columns: the ID, the title, the entry, and the date entered. You can see the definition for each column on the slide. To create a new table, the example code is taken from the createtable.php file script 12.3. It defines a query to create the entries table, then runs the query in the database. First, create a string that contains the createTableSQL command and store it in the query variable. The SQL command creates the entries table, including the 4 columns described previously. For each column definition, you see the name and then the data type. Then you see the not null constraint. This means that the field cannot be blank. A value must be provided. So a record cannot be inserted that does not have a value in any of these fields. For the ID column, you see the auto increment constraint. This will automatically assign a number each time a record is inserted. The number is the next number in sequence following the last number used. Basically, it starts at 1 for the first record and increments by 1 for each record inserted. Then, for the ID column, you also see the primary key constraint. The primary key is a unique value that identifies each record. In this case, the automatic sequence number will be used as the primary key. Run the create table query using the MySQLi query function. By the way, it really isn't typical to run a create table command this way. In this case, it's just used as an example of how to run an SQL command. You would usually use an application such as phpMyAdmin to run the SQL directly in the database. I will create the table in my database the typical way using phpMyAdmin. On my web server control panel, select the MySQL option. Then select the phpMyAdmin application for my database. Double-click the database name on the left to make it active. Select the SQL tab, then type or copy the create table command from the slide. Don't include the quotes. They're necessary for creating a string in PHP, but they're not part of the SQL command. Paste the create table command in the SQL tab and press the go button. You should see the new table appear in the list on the left. To see the table definition, click on the entries table name in the left, then select the Structure tab. You should see 4 columns and other information about their definitions. It's up to you which way you choose. Either one will create the same table. Inserting data into a database. Use the insert SQL command to add new records to a table. The insert command has 2 formats. Use the first syntax when inserting a value into every column in the table. Start with the insert into command keywords, then the name of the table that you're adding records to, then the values keyword, then the opening parenthesis, then the values for the columns, and finally the closing parenthesis. The order of the values has to match the order of the columns in the table. The database will map the first value to the first column, the second value to the second column, and so on. The second syntax is very similar to the first, except that it includes the column names. Use this syntax when you're only inserting a value into some of the columns in the table. Values will only be inserted into the column names included in the list. Look at the example on the slide. The insert SQL command will insert a record into the example table. It will only insert values into the name and age columns. The value for the name column will be Jonah, and the value for the age column will be 1. Then call the MySQLi query function as before to run the query in the database. To enter data into a database from an HTML form, the example code is taken from the addEntry.php file Script12.4. It inserts a new record into the entries table. First, create a string that contains the insert SQL command and store it in the query variable. The SQL command inserts a record into the entries table. In this case, it's using the syntax where the column names are specified. But since the values are provided for every column in the table, the other syntax would work as well. Recall that the ID field is set to auto increment, so the actual value will be set by the database. Pass a 0 in the value for the ID column, and MySQL will automatically assign the next ID value. The title and entry fields are set to the values that were entered on the form and stored in the title and entry variables. The date entered field is set to the current date and time by using the now database function. Run the insert query using the MySQLi query function. If an error occurs in the insert command, call the MySQLi error function to get detailed information about the error. Look at the print function in the example on the slide. Calling the MySQLi error function will return the detailed error message from the insert command. The image shows an example of what the error message would look like. Securing query data. You should always be cautious when accepting input from a web form. There is always the possibility that a user will enter something to intentionally hack into or break your website. A user could even attempt to run their own SQL queries. This is called SQL injection. You can see an example on the slide where a user attempted to drop the entries table. Read the description in the textbook about how this could happen. Before using any form data in a query, call the MySQLi real escape string function. The function escapes potentially harmful characters. It makes the string safe to use in an SQL query. The function takes 2 arguments, the database connection and the original string. It returns a string with the special characters escaped. To secure query data, the addEntry.php file in Script12.5 has been updated to include the escape function. The first 2 lines of code on the slide show where the title and entry fields on the form are being cleaned up. First, the strip tags function is called to remove any HTML tags. Then the trim function is called to remove any extra spaces. Finally, the MySQLi real escape string function is called to escape any special characters. This code shows a condensed way of calling multiple PHP functions. In this case, it calls a function inside another function. And even though this works perfectly well, it may not be as easy to understand. You could split out each function call as in the last code example on the slide. Either way produces the same results. Retrieving data from a database. Use the select SQL command to retrieve records from a table. The basic syntax is first the select keyword, then the list of columns to select or an asterisk for all columns, then the from keyword, and finally the name of the table to select from. Look at the first example on the slide. Select asterisk from users. The asterisk means to select all columns. So this query will select all columns from the users table. It will also return every row. The second query is like the first one, except it only selects the name and email columns. So this query will select the name and email columns from the users table. It will also return every row. The third query is also similar to the first one, except it includes a where clause to limit the number of rows returned. The where clause acts like a filter to only return rows that match the criteria. In this case, we only want records that contain the name equal Larry. The results from a select query are different than other queries. The select returns actual records from the database. You still use the MySQLi query function to run the SQL command, but for select query, you have to assign the results to a variable. It works like this. Create a select query, run the query using the MySQLi query function, assign the results to a variable. The variable will contain an array of the records selected. In the example code on the slide, you will run the SQL command stored in the query variable using the DBC database connection, and the row selected will be stored in the result variable. Once you have the results, you'll need to fetch the rows. Typically, this is done in a loop until all rows have been processed. Use the MySQLi fetch array function to read a record from the query results. This function fetches one row at a time, starting with the first row in the results. Call the MySQLi fetch array function with the result variable that contains the query results. Assign the record that is returned to a variable. In this case, it's assigned to the row variable. Each row that is returned is actually an associative array. The name of each element is the same as the name of the field selected from the table. There will be one element for each field selected. For example, to get the value of the name selected, use row, open square bracket, name, close square bracket. Use a loop to access all the records returned by the select query. Inside the loop, call the MySQLi fetch array function to read the next row, and continue until there are no more rows. The while loop works because the MySQLi fetch array function returns a null when there are no more rows. This causes the condition to no longer be true and stops the loop. To retrieve data from a table. The example code is taken from the viewentries.php file script12.6. It defines a select query to read the entries table, then runs the query and displays the results. First, create the select query. This one selects all columns from the entries table. The results are sorted by the date entered field in descending order, meaning most recent first. Store the select query command in the query variable. Next, run the query using the MySQLi query function. The results of the query are stored in the R variable. If the query returns any records, we will process them next. When running the select query, we expect to get multiple records in the results. We use a while loop to process each record in the results. Use the MySQLi fetch array function to read a record at a time from the results. The current record is stored in the row variable. Continue the while loop until all rows have been processed. Inside the loop, we display each record. First, show the title inside the H3 HTML tag. Then show the blog entry. Then create the edit entry and delete entry hyperlinks. For each hyperlink, include the ID for the blog entry. Finally, display a horizontal rule to separate each blog entry. Deleting data in a database. The delete SQL command removes records from a table. The basic syntax is: first, the delete from keywords, then the name of the table that records will be deleted from. Finally, the where clause to identify specifically which records to delete. There's a huge caution here. Leaving off the where clause will delete every record in the table. Occasionally you might want to clear a table, and in that case leaving off the where to delete every record is perfectly acceptable. But most often you will be deleting specific records. In that case you must include the where clause. This is a very common mistake. Running a delete query without the where clause will delete every record in the table. You run the delete SQL command using the MySQLi query function. Then you run the MySQLi affected rows function to see how many rows were deleted. To delete data from a database. The example code is taken from the deleteentry.php file script 12.7. It defines a delete query to remove a record from the entries table, then runs a query and checks the number of rows deleted. First, create the delete query. This one deletes a record from the entries table. Specifically, it deletes the record with the ID equal the ID in the post array. This is the ID that is submitted from the form for the record that is currently being displayed. Store the delete query in the query variable. Next, run the query using the MySQLi query function. The results are stored in the R variable. Finally, check that the number of records deleted is equal to 1. Call the MySQLi affected rows function to get the count of the number of rows deleted. Updating data in a database. The update SQL command modifies records in a table. The basic syntax is: first the update keyword, then the name of the table that records will be updated, then the set keyword, then a list of column names and values to change separated by commas. Finally, the where clause to identify specifically which records to update. Again, there is a caution here. Leaving off the where clause will update every record in the table. Occasionally, you might want to update the entire table, and in that case, leaving off the where to update every record is perfectly acceptable. But most often, you will be updating specific records, and in that case, you must include the where clause. This is a very common mistake. Running an update command without a where clause will update every record in the table. You run the update SQL command using the MySQLi query function. Then you can run the MySQLi affected rows function to see how many rows were updated. To update data from a database. The example code is taken from the editentry.php file script 12.8. It defines an update query to modify a record from the entries table. Then runs a query and checks the number of rows updated. First, create the update query. This one updates a record in the entries table. Specifically, it updates the record with the ID equal the ID in the post array. This is the ID that is submitted from the form for the record that is currently being displayed. It updates the title and entry fields to the values entered on the form. Store the update query command in the query variable. Next, run the query using the MySQLi query function. The results of the query are stored in the R variable. Finally, check that the number of records updated is equal to 1. Call the MySQLi affected rows function to get a count of the number of rows updated.